Good afternoon. My name is Deborah Davis, and I'm the president and co-founder of the Women's History Project, and we are celebrating International Women's Day. Today, I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, which is on the unceded land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I'd like to acknowledge the Algonquin and Anishinaabe community and pay my respects to their past, present, and future elders. The Women's History Project is a relatively new not-for-profit organization. Our ambition is to promote the role, achievements, and contributions of women in Canadian history. Working with partner organizations, we want to provide opportunities for experienced women's history through conversations, discussions, and storytelling. This is our opportunity to profile and highlight the campaigns and the women who led them, bold issues, the move to greater women's equality, and how that resonates today. And we want to make history engaging. And we want to create opportunities for young people to be involved in the production of videos telling those stories. Today's session is our fourth virtual event this year, and there are ample subjects to cover in the months ahead. I want to thank our panelists in advance of what I know will be a stunning session. Thank you to our sponsors, CREA, Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, the University of Ottawa Special Collections and Archives, and Rise Up Feminist Archives. A special thank you to Nancy's very own foundation, who makes our work possible. I'd like to thank our board and also to our wonderful group of young women who help with all our communications and social media. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to set the scene. Reproductive justice may be a newish concept, but it's not a new issue. While birth control had been practiced throughout history, it was largely a taboo subject in the 19th century. In 1869, a law was passed in Canada that made abortions illegal. And in the 1890s, the first criminal code made the distribution of material about contraception and contraceptive products criminal offenses. Discussions about birth control and eugenics started before World War I, and by the 1920s, groups were formed to advocate for birth control, and the 1892 contraception law was challenged. In the 1960s, it was a time of great change. The concept of motherhood, women's liberation, the production and the sale of the birth control pill, and challenges to abortion laws were all hot topics. The dissemination of birth control information was illegal until 1969. Forced adoptions and babies for sale were not uncommon. Heather Marshall's novel Looking for Jane, for instance, is receiving critical acclaim on this topic. Added to this was the advent of reproductive technologies in the 1970s and 1980s. There were intersectional and ethical issues around access, sterilization, sexual identity, and social class. This discussion today is ultimately about women wanting to control when or if they had families, and others who went to extraordinary measures to have children. Some of these topics will be discussed today. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Donna Cherniak co-authored the Birth Control Handbook in 1968 when she was a McGill Art student. Soon after, she co-founded an illegal abortion referral service, counseling women who came to Montreal for abortions from all over Quebec, Canada, and the US. She continued to revise the handbook with the Feminist Montreal Health Press, and co-authored its publication on sexually transmitted diseases and menopause. Donna began her medical career at a Montreal CLSC, the Centre de Santé des Femmes, and practiced abortions at Dr. Morgan Tyler's clinic. She has collaborated with government and professional committees to develop care standards in women's health, sexual assault, domestic violence, reproductive technologies, and such. Presently, Dr. Cherniak is a full clinical teacher in the Family Medicine Department, University of Sherbrooke. Her practice is concentrated in maternity care. She volunteers to train professionals in obstetrical care in countries with high maternal and neonatal mortality rates. Over to you, Donna.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you and the Women's Health History Project for this opportunity to reminisce and to go back to the creation of the Birth Control Handbook, which was really a groundbreaking event in the history of feminist and reproductive justice in Canada. So we do have to put it in a bit of context. Deborah said that the 60s were a time of optimism, of demonstrations, of activism, but that was not the worldview. The institutions, the social discourse were still traditional. They were still that women were expected to be virgins until married. Contraception, both the information and accessibility, was illegal. Abortion was illegal, inaccessible, and dangerous unless you had the money to fly to England. That was the context when at McGill University, a left-wing slate won at the student council, and they had on their platform the giving information on contraception for the students. At the same time, a math professor of all things, Donald Kingsbury, wrote about abortion in the McGill Daily in an article entitled, "We Send Her to the Butcher Shop." And I thought it was worth reading you a couple of lines from Donald Kingsbury's article. "Judge the world which tortures its own rosy-cheeked daughters with humiliation and terror and fear and pain and guilt, which subjects them to unnecessary disease, maiming, and death. Judge the world which talks about the sanctity of an unwanted life that it isn't willing to care for or love or feed. Judge the Canadian government which murders 1,000 girls each year in a most horrible way." So that really shook things up on the campus, and the Student Council and the Women's Union created a committee to prepare a handbook on contraception. It was mostly political science students who were involved in this project, nobody with any health background. But the supervisor was Dr. Robert Kinch from the Montreal General, and there's now a chair in women's health in his name. The handbook was published in the fall of 1968 and distributed to all students at McGill, Sir George Williams University, and Loyola. The book described how the methods worked, but it also went deeply into the political and social context of sexual health. It was illegal, but interestingly, there was no pushback from authorities at that point. News of the book was picked up quickly in different universities in Canada and elsewhere, and demands for copies came in immediately. The student union was unable to handle this distribution, and it was taken over by myself and Alan Feingold from our apartment. The book was a resounding success. 300,000 copies in the next 2 years, and over 2 million by 1971. Now in Canada, those are really big numbers. They were sent to universities, health clinics, CEGEPs when they started, and some high schools, and they were always required to give them out for free. Rapidly, Alan and I were contacted by women looking for abortions. So we set up an abortion referral service in our apartment where we referred people to 3 Montreal doctors, and we created a model for abortion counseling that is still in use. Women, this is prior to Roe versus Wade, so women came from Canada and the US to our apartment and were dispatched to the different clinics. Both the handbook distribution and the abortion referral service were eventually moved to the Montreal Women's Centre. The handbook was translated into French and adapted for Quebec context, specifically with the role of the church in reproduction. This is so that you see what it looked like in newsprint that came off on your hands. So these books were, they were like bread and butter all over the country. But distribution led to the creation of the Montreal Health Press, a women's collective, which distributed the books, revised them, and went on to do books on sexually transmitted diseases, menopause, and sexual assault, all in both languages. And all of the members of the health press were involved in multiple feminist actions in Montreal around contraceptive services, daycare, birthing, prevention of sexual assault and care of victims, and the creation of women's studies programs in higher education. So what was special about the handbook? Why was it so groundbreaking? What was our legacy? Well, first of all, it was illegal. So just the information was already groundbreaking. But the big one is that contraception is about people. It's not about plumbing. And if you looked at even medical textbooks, it was all about plumbing, about how an egg needs a sperm and how you can prevent that. But contraception is about negotiating sexual activity, about people having different priorities or values and how they want to do that, and people being in different circumstances, and we addressed that. Contraception is political, how it's researched, where it's researched, and the pill has a dirty history. How is it promoted? By whom? What is available? Where is it available? What does it cost? Who controls it? Contraception is key to women's autonomy, to their self-determination, and their ability to fully participate in society. Contraception is supportive of families. It is not against them. And that's certainly something we had been accused of. The birth control handbooks were sex positive. They were not judgmental. They were respectful of people's choices. And that's both in the text and in the photo commentary that we had. We were very clear on our position of abortion, and I will tell you that we had requests, can we reprint a book without the section on abortion? No. We talked about abortion as a responsible choice, and that it was a varied event depending on the circumstances that people were living. It could be the pregnancy could have been just a fluke accident. It could have been a wanted pregnancy where the conditions were no longer what they were when the pregnancy was planned. And an important thing about abortion is that its existence, its availability is an essential component of reproductive health, because it allows women to use methods that may interfere less with their health, which is important for people, and allows them to accept some degree of a less effective method because they know that they have this option should it be needed. Our books promoted quality, publicly funded healthcare as essential and contraceptive health as being part of that. And we promoted research and training on women's issues. Women were not included in studies at that point, hardly ever. We were amongst those who started simulations for pelvic exams so that people in training could learn what it feels like to go through that, because they had immediate and direct response from the people working there. We also said that people wanted reproductive health education, and that they were capable of understanding complex issues, that they wanted to know more. And we made an effort to really humanize that information, both by our photos, our graphics, all of which we're very proud of. The Montreal Health Press and the distribution of the birth control handbook continued until the year 2000. And there was a question, it was online at some point through the Museum of Human Rights in Manitoba. And it still remains a source and an inspiration for people, because what is out there, unfortunately, there's a little more about humanity, but there's a lot more about plumbing. And that's where I'll leave it with you.
Our next speaker, Karin Wells, is a journalist, lawyer, and author living in Port Hope. Her book, The Abortion Caravan When Women Shut Down the Government and the Battle for the Right to Choose, was the story of the almost forgotten 1970 cross-country crusade undertaken by 13 young Vancouver women to put abortion on the table for discussion and demand change. It won the 2021 Alison Prentice Award for Women's History and was a finalist for the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing. Her most recent book is More Than a Footnote, Canadian Women You Should Know, an irreverent look at 10 bold women who, by dint of personality and ability, went where no woman has gone before. As a CBC radio journalist, she worked in more than 50 countries, regularly winning international awards for her documentaries on post-conflict resolution, medical and legal issues told through individual stories. Karin Wells is also a member of the University of Ottawa's Common Law Honor Society.
The Abortion Caravan, indeed, 1970. So now, 52 years ago? And as you said, almost forgotten. It took 25 years after the abortion caravan, which did, quote, shut down government, before anybody wrote about it at all. And then it was in a not published master's thesis at Simon Fraser University. The women who took part in this were shamed afterwards. So it was a big part of women's history that just wasn't told. Here's the nuts and bolts of what it was. As Deborah said, it was 13 young women. This comes out of Vancouver. This started at Simon Fraser University, which was in the late 60s, a very radical place to be. And what they decided to do was to put together a caravan of 3 vehicles. What a circus it was. There was a pickup truck, a Volkswagen bus with a coffin on the top, and a Pontiac Parisienne convertible. And the coffin symbolized, they were saying 2,000 women who died because of illegal abortions. And just a little context there, in 1969, there was an amendment to the criminal code, which changed a great many things, including it legalized the sale of contraception, hard to believe, and it allowed abortion in extremely limited circumstances. And the tininess of the reform, if you like, angered these women almost as much as anything else. So they formed this caravan. They were going to march on Ottawa, as it were, and demand. At that time, nobody negotiated, everybody demanded. It was a confrontational period. A meeting with the Prime Minister, then Pierre Trudeau, the Health Minister, John Munro, and the Minister of Justice, John Turner. And the letters that went back and forth were quite incredible, saying, yes, we demand, no, you won't, etc. They made 11 stops along the way across Canada. Many of them had never driven outside BC before. Some of them couldn't drive at all. Slept on church floors. The United Church was very, very much behind them. They did guerrilla theater. They were noisy. They were loud. They were impolite. All the things that women were not supposed to be. And by the time they got to Ottawa, the 13 had turned into 500. They had they'd added buses out of Toronto. A good many cars joined them in Saskatchewan, and that was interesting because many of those who joined in Saskatchewan were the daughters of people who had been active in the fight for Medicare 8 or 10 years earlier, which, you know, there's a continuum in all of our history, which was very important. They marched on Ottawa, on Parliament Hill. They were not given a meeting. I think 3 NDP members of Parliament came and met them, including Grace McInnes, the only woman in Parliament at the time, and 1 Conservative, who I think, and I haven't looked it up, was Jed Baldwin, who I believe is Chrystia Freeland's uncle, and was responsible for much of the Freedom of Information Act. Anyway, they had that brief meeting. Henry Morgentaler was there, and they booed him. They booed him, I think, because he was a man. For no other reason than that, and they felt it was their issue. They then marched down to 24 Sussex Drive, sat on the Prime Minister's lawn. The RCMP didn't know what to do with them. And then it started to rain, and they all went home again, as it were. But they met that night and decided the next day, through forged passes, parliamentary passes, and they would get 35 of their number into the galleries of the House of Commons. In the meantime, 200 other women, because they were very aware that the RCMP had their eyes on them. The RCMP had trailed them, followed them all the way across the country. And they chained themselves to their seats in the gallery, and at a given time, sign right at the beginning of question period, 1 woman stood up and began a speech that they had all rehearsed together. And as soon as the guards came and took her away, and it took a little bit of time because she was chained, another woman would pop up. And as one of the guards said afterwards, they were popping up all over the place. And indeed they were. And they were taken away, and Lucien Lamoureux, the speaker, closed down the session, and nobody was arrested. Nothing urgent happened. And the next day they were on the front page of every newspaper in the country. So they had made a splash. Now, many people have put down that movement, one, because it was extra parliamentary, if you like, and two, because it didn't ostensibly seem to do anything. It took another 18 years, 1988, before the Supreme Court decision that decriminalized abortion, the Morgentaler decision. And this gets into the takeaway points, if you like. Sally Mahood, who was one of the women, and Donna's smiling, I wonder why. She was, second year university, part of the Caravan. Her mother was not only a doctor, a psychiatrist, must have been two women psychiatrists in the country at the time. And Sally went on to become an OBGYN and continues to teach in Saskatchewan. But what Sally said is, let me find the quote. It's simple. We brought abortion, an issue that no one wanted to talk about in public. We brought it on the table and kept it on the table and said, we will not go away until something happens. And just as an illustration of what she means, the young woman who drove the Volkswagen bus all the way across the country was, I think, 19 at the time. When they stopped in Calgary, she stayed with her aunt. And her aunt said, I don't approve of what you're doing. She said, I've had 2 abortions. And Kathy was absolutely gobsmacked. This was just not what was discussed. She said, but we do not talk about this in public. And that was the problem. Because until you can't change something until you acknowledge that the problem exists. So that was very, very telling. The other thing to note, it's very important, it was a political decision that these Vancouver women, they were all left-wing women, held a meeting at UBC in 1969, I think, with women from Saskatchewan West. And keep in mind, there were plenty of doctors in the West who were doing what Henry Morgentaler, to a degree, was doing in the East, in the sense that they were practicing and giving safe but illegal abortions. Robert Makarov in Vancouver spent longer in jail, I think, than Dr. Morgentaler. There was Charles Ringrose in Edmonton, who was thrown out of the Alberta Medical Association because he started a Planned Parenthood chapter, and on it went. But what they met at UBC, and they said, that we want to establish a national women's movement. And Judy Rebick has said that the abortion caravan was actually the first grassroots national women's action. And they identified a number of issues. They said, we're worried about equal pay for equal work. We're worried about more inclusion of women's issues in the unions, etc. And we're also deeply concerned about abortion. And which one do we rally around? At the time, only 40% of women were in the labor force. So equal pay for equal work didn't have the same impact. And they consciously decided that the abortion issue was the one that would glom women together. They felt it cut across economic lines, it cut across regional lines. It affected so many women. And that's why they organized around this issue. I should add that when they marched in Ottawa, they were well enough organized. Keep in mind, there were no long distance phone calls, no email. There was nothing. There was the Bush telegraph, if you like, not much more. But simultaneously, there were demonstrations at all the provincial capitals. It was a feat of organization that was somewhat unrivaled. They had 2 advanced women who had arrived in Ottawa and they had bail money in their purse because they were quite convinced that they would be arrested. Just one other point, and then I'll stop. They were criticized for being very white, and they were, when you look at the photographs, there are very few black or brown faces that look back at them. Note too that their office in Vancouver was right next door to the Red Power movement, which was key. Lee Maricoll, a big Indigenous activist, was very much part of that. But obviously, and perhaps Jennifer will get to this later, I don't know, the issue of sterilization of First Nations women was very much part of things. And when they went through Alberta, the eugenics law was still on the books. So, and of course, it was equally political on the other side. The right to life movement had not yet really begun. Politically, government was not about to try and amend the abortion law or change the criminal code because of the electoral base. So, that's what the abortion caravan was. I think I've spoken to 45 or 50 women who were part of it. All of them, interestingly, have stayed politically active ever since. Everybody knows that you don't let up, that these things will turn around and bite you if you ignore them in any way. Many of them moved over the environmental movement, but these are active women still.
I'd like to introduce our third speaker, Maureen McTeer. Maureen is a lawyer specializing in health law, an author of 5 books, and a well-known women's rights advocate. Her 5th and current book, Fertility, 40 Years of Change, covers the major issues of infertility, assisted human reproductive technologies, genetics, and embryo research.
Well, thanks very much, Deborah, for that introduction. And I begin today by acknowledging, as you did, that I'm joining you from Ottawa, which is situated on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and which is also home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And for the past 150 years, it has been home to my own family, and we gratefully thank them for allowing us to be here. I've published a book, as Deborah mentioned, recently called Fertility, 40 Years of Change. It's an historical, legal, and societal examination since the birth of the first IVF human baby in 1978 of the benefits, the risks, and the challenges presented to all of our societies by both reproductive technologies when used alone or in concert with genetic manipulation and genetic technologies in order to achieve a pregnancy and hopefully a healthy live birth. Now, we've heard from our 2 previous speakers, women for whom I have the deepest respect and admiration, of the history that they were part of and their role and contribution to women's struggle to ensure the right to abortion. That struggle remains in terms of access and is always under threat from people who believe that in the interests of the fetus, the legal rights of pregnant women should be removed. I believe we all watch in horror at what is happening in the United States, and all of us need to be conscious of any and all attempts by organized groups or political parties to limit our reproductive rights and choices here in Canada. In my book, I argue that there are many crucial public policy and legal challenges that are raised by the use and development of assisted human reproductive technologies and genetics, as well as embryo research. Now, I'll only mention 4 of these, which I consider to be very troubling. The first important issue, of course, and always should be, the question of women's health and women's safety. These technologies are developed and they are used on women's bodies. One of the principles set out in Section 2 of the Assisted Human Reproduction Act here in Canada says this quite clearly, and I quote, "While all persons are affected by these technologies, women more than men are directly and significantly affected by their application and the health and well-being of women must be protected in the application of these technologies, end of quote. Parliament then, and the provincial and territorial governments must ensure that both access and women's reproductive health are central to any new legislation going forward. A second issue, which is becoming increasingly controversial in terms of the entire healthcare system, but not, I don't think, recognized at all when it comes to clinical practice of assisted reproductive technologies, involves commercialization. The Act prohibits the buying of human gametes and both the buying and selling of human embryos. Commercial surrogacy is banned under the criminal code, but it's not enforced. Increasingly, the fertility market is under the commercial control of major private companies. One venture capital corporation owns the only fertility clinics in 3 provinces and several in the largest provinces by population. It also controls the outcome data and a significant share then of the Canadian fertility market. This is important for several reasons, but one of the most important is that there is no way that we can require them to disclose key information, such as how many pregnancies were achieved using what technologies. Of these, how many led to live births? Or there's also the issue of data that backs up increasingly obvious claims that some of the so-called add-ons, usually very expensive in addition to the IVF, are advertised and give us no information whatsoever as to their use and their success as effective add-ons, if you will, in achieving a pregnancy. A third issue, which I find quite concerning and which is being hotly discussed in the United Kingdom and parts of the United States right now, relates to the 14-day rule. This is the uppermost limit which scientists can carry out research on human embryos. It applies in Canada, indeed it applies in most countries of the world. There's a significant push right now, a huge push actually, by scientists, leading scientists, to move that goalpost and even, some argue, to remove any time limits whatsoever on embryo research. The fourth issue, again, one of a concern, and there are many, which is why, of course, you get to buy the book in ebook form or hard copy. A friend of mine actually, for my last book, said you're supposed to at least 10 times when you're giving a speech, make sure that you mention your latest book. So I'll spare you that, but now I've done it twice. I think that's well enough. But the fourth point is the whole question of infertility and sterility. Going forward, we have to address the growing problem of both, especially in men. We know that some of the social factors, socioeconomic factors, women are choosing to have children later in life, and therefore there are a variety of issues. We also know, if we have had a chance to read the website of the Canadian Fertility and Andrology Society, that 1 in 6 Canadians need assistance in conceiving and carrying a child to term. Indeed, the Canadian Fertility and Andrology Society estimates that 15% of couples seek medical advice for infertility-related problems, and that fully 2/3 of them need specialist intervention. And so these are very, very important questions. Environmental pollution is contributing a great deal to this. One concern is the increase of genital, sperm, and related abnormalities in both animals and humans, caused by these chemicals and these pollutants that are all around us. An article by a respected investigative journalist in the New York Times should give us pause. She writes that, and I quote her, from 1973 to 2011, the sperm count of average men in Western countries had fallen by 69%. In my book, I outline how environmental legislation can be updated to address this major fertility issue. In ending my remarks at this point this afternoon, I'd like to speak ever so briefly to the push that is now underway, especially in the US, to create an artificial womb. Labeled as ectogestation by its proponents, the purpose is to develop a machine that can hold a fetus at its very, very early stages of development, all through the normal gestation period to full term and birth. Now, we can all share the pain and that women feel when they suffer a miscarriage or when they have a very, very early delivery. But there are real risks to women's autonomy and reproductive rights that must be analyzed, and they must be resolved as part of any attempt to develop such a machine as a standard reproductive tool. What might these be? Well, for instance, by pushing back the point of viability so significantly, will we also face demands by anti-choice groups and religions to prohibit terminations after that point or at all? Will women seeking terminations of a pregnancy have to consider or even be required to give up the fetus to be gestated and saved by this new machine? If so, is this just another form of adoption? Who is the mother in such cases? What are her rights in such situations? And more importantly, when such a machine exists, can she really refuse to comply? What about the rights of any future child who is the product of such an arrangement? Will that child be told the truth? We see this lack of clarity already with donor anonymity and gamete providers. So these are some of the questions that have preoccupied me for the past three or four decades. And I'm delighted that I have been asked to participate, and I look forward, along with my colleagues, to addressing questions which you, as other colleagues, if you will have for us.
Thank you, Maureen. And our last speaker this afternoon is Jennifer Brant. Kanan Kaha is a mother scholar and assistant professor at the University of Toronto. Jennifer writes and teaches about Indigenous maternal pedagogies, reproductive justice for Indigenous women, and Indigenous literature. Jennifer is the co-editor of Forever Loved, exposing the hidden crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. And her work on Indigenous mothering is featured in several Demeter Press collections. Jennifer positions Indigenous literature as educational tools to foster socio-political action and calls for immediate responses to the racialized, sexualized, and gender-based violence.
Sego Sewagwego, thank you so much for that introduction, and really honored to be here and be part of this conversation. So I'm just going to begin by sort of contextualizing what reproductive injustice for Indigenous women entails. So reproductive justice, or rather reproductive injustice for Indigenous women, is the removal of Indigenous women's rights to physically birth children, as well as the continued interference for Indigenous women to physically raise their own children, a phenomena that is created and that continues to create ruptures among generations. And so I'll get to that. But I want to begin by mapping out Indigenous women's reproductive injustice by framing it within the erasure of indigeneity. So the genocide of Indigenous peoples on this land and the connection between violence of the land and violence of the body, all of which can be understood within the context of worldviews colliding. And so it's important to ask, what happens when a matriarchal worldview clashes with a patriarchal worldview? And so as a Gatnegahaga woman, a Mohawk woman, I come from a matrilineal and matriarchal community. Indigenous women's reproductive injustice can also be broadly understood within the often quoted Cheyenne proverb that a nation is not conquered until the hearts of its women are on the ground. Indeed, Indigenous women are central to birthing the nation and future generations. And so historical attacks on Indigenous women are rooted in a deep history of settler colonialism, and as I mentioned, genocide on these lands. And a big part of that is the history of eugenics and racialized, sexualized violence against Indigenous women. And so this is deeply connected to the control of lands in terms of the development of the nation state. So I teach about maternal pedagogies, and part of that involves teaching about racialized, sexualized, gender-based violences, and an extension of that, reproductive injustice and calls for reproductive justice. And so I draw on the work of Darlene Juska, who identifies three main junctures of the interference that serve as attacks on Indigenous gender relations and Indigenous mothering. And so one of the first junctures is government-conferred identity, the dismantling of matriarchal and matrilineal communities. And so one of these points was the Indian Act of Canada and Section 12(1)(b) of the Indian Act, which controlled Indigenous women's rights to status under the Indian Act of Canada. The second juncture is the residential school system, which ran from 1831 to 1996 and enforced a gender binary. So boys were trained in farming trades, girls prepared for domestic labor. But as my colleague, Dr. Kim Anderson, argues that for all of the training in domestication, Indigenous girls left residential schools and still were unable to mother their own children. So for colonization to be successful, it was also necessary to dismantle gender fluidity and the equivalent gender relations among Indigenous people and kinship communities. Divide and conquer has always been a frequently practiced hegemonic strategy among the colonizers. The third juncture is healthcare. And so in Canada, we have a history of healthcare segregation. This involves coerced sterilization, disregard for Indigenous midwifery and Indigenous models of healthcare. But there were Indian hospitals that were established, and Indigenous women were unable to go to the same hospital as non-Indigenous women. Dr. Maureen Lux writes about this in her book, Separate Beds, A History of Indian Hospitals in Canada. So I add a fourth juncture here, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the experimental birth control on Indigenous women. And so it was mentioned already that for a long time in Canada, birth control was illegal and in fact punishable under the Criminal Code of Canada until 1969. However, throughout the 1960s, even though birth control was still illegal at the time, Indigenous women were being experimented on. And so they were given experimental birth control before it was medically approved elsewhere. So not just was it illegal, but it also wasn't medically approved. The control and eradication of Indigenous motherhood in Canada has involved a number of colonial policies that intervened with Indigenous women's rights to both birth and mother their own children. And so a significant part of this control of Indigenous women's bodies took part during the moralizing campaigns of the late 1800s. It is these campaigns that created and sustained derogatory images of Indigenous women as promiscuous, uncivilized, and uncivilizing. And these campaigns thus justified the targeting of Indigenous women's ability to birth and mother their own children. Despite these campaigns, white women were in awe of the leadership authority of Indigenous women, and it has been documented that the feminist movement in Canada was actually inspired by the matriarchal and matrilineal structure of many Indigenous communities. However, this threatened the patriarchal underpinnings of Western expansion and women's so-called place as angels of the home. So this is a really deep and gendered history. It's important to understand the history of eugenics in Canada in relation to the forced sterilization of Indigenous women as well. So mixed with early 20th century social Darwinism, the eugenics movement of the late 19th and 20th centuries proposed the necessity to cleanse and purify the social body in order that human evolution arrived at its proper place in history. So troubling and but really important to note is that the Famous Five, or Alberta's Famous Five, were central to passing the 1928 Sterilization Act. These Famous Five, well known for their role in early white feminism, worked to secure personhood for women, but that was for white women, middle class to elite, and largely Christian. In fact, they were opposed to immigration into Canada of those classified as non-white. Well known as maternal feminists, we cannot forget that early suffragettes such as Nellie McClung and Emily Murphy were strong supporters of Alberta's Sterilization Act. And so while this act targeted many women in Canada, it significantly targeted Indigenous women who were held to these derogatory stereotypes and already viewed and deemed to be unfit to raise and birth their own children. And so just outlining this history of eugenics in Canada, I think it's important to note that the Alberta Sterilization Act was in effect from 1928 to 1973. And so talking about some of these other campaigns that year, 1972, and for British Columbia, the Sterilization Act was in effect in 1973, right? So not that long ago, and thinking about what we've already heard in this panel of what was happening in the 1970s across Canada. So other provinces in Canada did not have explicit sterilization acts, but equally engaged in the practice of coerced sterilization within this framework of eugenics. Consent for sterilization of Indigenous women is documented that it was only sought in 17% of cases. And so I think even though 17% is a really troubling number, that we also need to really consider what consent means within the context of coerced sterilization. And we're still seeing cases of coerced sterilization of Indigenous women today. Yvonne Boyer recently released a scoping review of Indigenous women's tubal litigation that documents this troubling practice, as well as the numerous recent cases that we've seen. Indigenous women continue to come forward. And this is a practice that is happening largely among prairie provinces, but across the nation as well. So this really speaks to calls for accountability and justice. Resistance then to sterilization has become a defining aspect of Indigenous women's calls for Indigenous women's reproductive justice. Indigenous women's bodies continue to be sites of surveillance and control. And this has significantly affected their roles in terms of passing on cultural knowledge to the next generation. Also must be understood alongside the removal of Indigenous children from the home, another practice that continues today. And Dr. Cindy Blackstock now refers to this as the Millennium Scoop. So some of you may be familiar with the 60s scoop. I encourage you to look into Dr. Cindy Blackstock's work as well in terms of the Millennium Scoop. So this tells us that historical attacks on Indigenous women were and continue to be intentionally gendered and intricately connected to recent attacks on Indigenous motherhood. So there's this connection that is important to understand between a history of gendered and racialized violence, as well as contemporary forms of racialized, sexualized, and gender-based violences. For Indigenous women, reproductive justice includes the ability to transmit their culture to children. As I mentioned, reproductive injustice is sort of this attack on that ability to transmit culture. A recent case of this, and there might be more time to talk about this in the Q&A, because I'm probably running out of time, but I encourage you to also do a little bit of research into the response to international award-winning throat singer Tanya Tagaq when she was advocating for seal hunting rights. And so what the response and this sort of racialized, sexualized violence that targeted her role as a mother, because she was passing on a specific cultural teaching about seal hunting to her daughter, right? So I encourage you to do a little bit of research into that. Another connection between this history of eugenics and the forced sterilization of Indigenous women was expressed in the final report of the National Public Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, Trans, and Two-Spirit Peoples. And so of the 231 calls for justice that came out of the National Public Inquiry's final report was the call to eliminate birth or hospital alerts. And so call to justice 12.8 calls for this end of the practice of birth alerts, otherwise known as hospital alerts, where Indigenous women or children are apprehended at birth. And so the calls to justice released in 2019, and Ontario just eliminated birth alerts in July 2021, so about a year and a half ago, right? And other provinces have followed suit. I believe Quebec has still not eliminated this practice. And just sort of wrapping up here, a discussion on Indigenous women's reproductive injustice is not complete without noting the work of Gatnega midwife Gaji Cook, who is a founder of the Akwesasne Mother's Milk Project. And this kind of aligns with what Maureen was just talking about in terms of environmental legislation. So the Akwesasne Mother's Milk Project was created because Akwesasne women were worried about the reproductive health effects of toxic contaminants that can be found in breast milk that has led to high miscarriage rates. And so as a midwife, Gaji Cook has been instrumental with the support of non-Indigenous midwives in supporting the revitalization of Indigenous midwifery, calling attention to environmental justice and the connection to reproductive justice, as well as revitalizing the spirit of birth. And so this entails a holistic understanding of what it means to welcome new life. So to this end, we are seeing decolonized possibilities for returning birth to Indigenous community, supporting urban doula projects, and supporting culturally based maternal teachings. These are all important components that are integral to reproductive justice for Indigenous women. And I just want to end as well with the work, with some of the work inspired by Dr. Kim Anderson, who reminds us that the health of a society is deeply connected to the treatment of women. So Nyawegoa, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jennifer. It gives me great pleasure this afternoon to again thank our speakers. I'd like to thank Donna Cherniak, Karin Wells, Maureen McTeer, and Jennifer Brant. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to thank all of you who attended this afternoon and hope that you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. I'd also like to thank again our sponsors, CREA, the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, the University of Ottawa Special Collections and Archives, Feminist Digital Archives, and Nancy's very own foundation. I'd like to give a heartfelt thanks to my volunteer board and to the fabulous group of young women who support us through our social media work. Again, thank you very much for joining us. If you'd like to find out more information about the Women's History Project, please visit us at www.womenshistoryproject.ca. Again, thank you.